Her new mother-in-law called her an ugly nurse, unworthy of her son. Hours later, the city's top surgeon was begging that same plain Jane to come to his hospital and perform a miracle. Like this video, and right where you are watching us from, we will be happy to send you our regards. So stay with us. Don't miss what's coming next. The West End of Atlanta is a neighborhood that holds its history close. The proud old Victorian houses with their wide, welcoming porches and meticulously tended gardens seem to watch you, their windows like knowing eyes. It's a place of deep roots, of Sunday church services, of neighbors who have measured their lives together in decades, not years. It is a place that values family, faith, and the comfortable, predictable order of things. And I, Imani Washington, was a disruption. I felt the judgment before I even stepped out of the car. It was a palpable thing, radiating from the windows of the house next door where two women stood silhouetted against the kitchen light, their heads together in a conspiracy of whispers. That must be Sister Beatrice and Ms. Pearl, my new husband Marcus had said, his voice full of an innocent hometown affection that I envied. They've been watching this street since the dawn of time. I offered a small, hesitant wave which was not returned. I was an unknown variable in their carefully balanced equation, and they did not like it. Marcus, my Marcus, was oblivious. He was home. He was their golden boy, the neighborhood success story, the handsome, brilliant engineer who had gone away and returned with a wife. He was so full of a joyful, infectious pride that he couldn't see the subtle, chilly currents of disapproval in the air. He saw his mother, Mildred, standing on the porch of the house he grew up in, and saw only a welcoming embrace. I saw the stiff set of her shoulders, the polite, paper-thin smile that did not reach her eyes, and I knew I was not what she had been expecting or wanting. "So, you're the one," she said, her voice smooth but cool as she looked me up and down. Her gaze was a slow, deliberate inventory of my failings. My simple department store dress, my practical, low-heeled shoes, my face, a face I knew was neat and pleasant, but would never be described as beautiful. My hands, which were clean and capable, but bore the faint telltale scars of a life of hard, intricate work. I did not, in any way, measure up to the imagined bride for her perfect son. Next to Marcus, with his easy charm and his movie star smile, I felt like a pale, quiet shadow, and I could see in his mother's eyes that she agreed. What could I say? That the woman standing before her was not a simple, plain nurse from a rundown industrial town in Indiana? That I was, in fact, one of the most gifted trauma surgeons of my generation? That my hands, which she was eyeing with such disdain, had once performed miracles, piecing together shattered bodies with the skill of a master artist? That I had traded a life of accolades, of respect, of six-figure salaries for this quiet, anonymous existence? No, I could say none of that. That woman, Dr. Imani Washington, was dead. I had buried her myself, 3 years ago, on a cold, rainy night in a city I had vowed never to return to. I was just Imani now, a wife, a nurse, a nobody. It was the life I had chosen. It was the price of my penance. Inside, Mildred's house was a museum of a life perfectly lived, or at least perfectly presented. Every surface gleamed, every photograph was artfully placed, and the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and a quiet, simmering disapproval. The neighbors, Sister Beatrice and Miss Pearl, happened to drop by, with a welcome cake, their eyes full of a sharp, bird-like curiosity as they took in my appearance. I was an exhibit, the strange and disappointing artifact their golden boy had brought home from his travels. I endured their polite, probing questions, my answers brief and quiet, giving them nothing to latch onto. I could feel their collective judgment settling on me like a heavy shroud. In their world of Sunday hats and social hierarchies, I was a failure, a woman who had somehow, inexplicably, landed a man far above her station. What they could never understand, what even Marcus didn't fully know, was that our love story had been forged not in the sunlit, manicured gardens of the West End, but in the gritty, struggling heart of Gary, Indiana. Our story began with the shriek of metal and a spray of blood. Marcus had been in Gary overseeing an engineering project at one of the last operational steel mills. A piece of heavy machinery had malfunctioned, a gear slipping, and in the split second it took for him to push a younger worker out of the way, his own hand was caught, crushed, and torn by the grinding teeth of the machine. He was rushed to the local hospital. a place that was underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. And that is where he met me. I was the on-call nurse in the ER that day, a title that was a vast understatement of my duties. In a place like Gary General, you were whatever the moment required you to be. The ER was in a state of controlled chaos, but when they wheeled Marcus in, a strange, profound calm settled over me. This I knew. The geography of trauma, the landscape of a wounded body, this was my true home. I cut away the blood-soaked makeshift bandage, my movements swift and sure. The wound was a mangled, horrific mess of torn flesh, exposed tendon, and crushed bone. The young resident on duty took one look at it and turned pale. "We need to call for a surgical consult," he stammered. "Maybe fly him to Chicago." "There's no time," I said, my voice quiet but imbued with an authority that made him stop. "The brachial artery is partially severed." He could lose the hand. Get me a suture kit, a vascular clamp, and prep him for a nerve block. Now. I wasn't a nurse in that moment. I was a commander, and this was my battlefield. Marcus, despite the agony he was in, was watching me, his engineer's mind analyzing, assessing. He saw the way I moved, the economy of my motions, the way I diagnosed the injury with a glance. You seem to know what you're doing," he gritted out through the pain. "I've seen worse," I said simply, as I began the delicate, intricate work of saving his hand. His eyes never left my face. He saw not a plain, simple nurse, but a woman of incredible, focused competence, a woman who moved with a quiet, life-saving grace. He was in the hospital for 3 days. I was his primary nurse. We talked. He asked me about my life, and I gave him the carefully edited version. The quiet orphan who had found a calling in medicine, who preferred the simple peace of a small town. He told me about his life in Atlanta, about his loud, loving, and overbearing mother, about his dreams of designing bridges that were not just strong, but beautiful. He fell in love, not with my face, but with my mind, with the passion that lit up my eyes when I spoke about the elegant, beautiful mathematics of the human body. He saw the person I kept hidden from the world. He asked me out the day he was discharged, his hand wrapped in a thick white bandage I had applied myself. Our first date was at a greasy spoon diner that smelled of stale coffee. We walked along the desolate, graffiti-strewn streets of a city that had been forgotten by the world. It was the least romantic setting imaginable, and it was the most romantic night of my life. For the first time in years, I felt like a person, not a ghost. He saw the sadness in me, the deep, carefully guarded sorrow I could never fully hide. He saw the way I would sometimes flinch at loud noises, the shadows that would sometimes cross my face when I thought he wasn't looking. He knew there was a story I wasn't telling him, a past I was running from. But he didn't push. He simply created a safe, quiet space for me to be myself, whoever that was. He fell in love with the mystery, with the quiet, broken woman who seemed to hold a universe of brilliance and pain within her. He returned to Atlanta, but he called me every single night, and 6 months later, he came back to Gary, Indiana. He met me after my shift at the hospital, and he took me not to a fancy restaurant, but to our diner. And there, in that booth that smelled of old vinyl and fried onions, he slid a small velvet box across the table. "I don't know who you're running from, Imani," he said, his voice full of a love so profound it made my heart ache. "But you don't have to run anymore. Come home with me. Let me be your sanctuary." Now, sitting in his mother's pristine living room, enduring the thinly veiled insults and the cold, judgmental stares, I felt a wave of profound gratitude for that man. He had not chosen me because I was beautiful, or because I came from a good family, or because I would look good on his arm. He had chosen me because he had seen the person I truly was, a person I had tried to keep buried. He was my sanctuary. And for him, I would endure this. I would endure anything. The dinner that evening was an exercise in quiet, polite hostility. Mildred served a beautiful meal, a perfect Southern feast, but every offering felt like a test, every question a carefully disguised interrogation. I sat at her perfectly set table, a ghost in a machine of tradition and expectation, feeling the weight of 3 sets of eyes on me, Sister Beatrice and Miss. Pearl had, of course, been invited to stay, their presence turning the family dinner into a tribunal. They wanted to know my story, not out of any genuine interest, but in the hopes of finding a flaw, a weakness, a piece of information that would confirm their initial assessment of me as unworthy of their golden boy. "So, a nurse," Mildred said, the word hanging in the air as she passed me the sweet potatoes. The way she said it, it sounded like an accusation. "Such rewarding work, I'm sure. Is your family in the medical field as well, dear?" "My parents passed away when I was young," I said quietly, meeting her gaze. "A car accident." A flicker of something, pity perhaps, or maybe just satisfaction at having found a crack in my history, crossed her face. "Oh, you poor thing, an orphan. That must have been so difficult." She was not offering sympathy. She was classifying me, putting me in a box labeled tragic and pitiable. It was a way to diminish me, to make my quietness not a choice, but a symptom of a broken past. "And just a nurse?" Sister Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with a cloying sweetness. "With your intelligence? Marcus always told us he would marry a professional woman. A lawyer, perhaps, or a professor?" The constant subtle attacks were beginning to wear on me. I had come to Atlanta to escape the judgment of the medical world, only to find a new, more personal kind of scrutiny. I looked at Marcus, who was shifting uncomfortably in his seat, caught between his loyalty to me and his lifelong deference to his mother, and I decided, in a small, quiet act of defiance, that I would not allow them to define me. "I am a doctor," I said, my voice soft but firm, causing all three women to stop mid-chew. "A trauma surgeon, or at least I was." I did not elaborate. I let the statement sit there, a puzzle they could not immediately solve. A surgeon? The quiet, plain woman in the cheap dress? The cognitive dissonance was plain on their faces, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a new wary curiosity. They had tried to put me in a box, and I had just informed them that they had fundamentally misunderstood its contents. It was into this thick, charged silence that my phone rang. The sound was a jarring intrusion. I never got calls from unknown numbers. My past life, with its constant, frantic pages from the hospital, was over. But some instincts never die. A surgeon's instinct, the one that tells you an unexpected call could mean the difference between life and death, made me reach for it. I excused myself from the table, my hand closing around the cool plastic of the phone. "Hello? Is this Dr. Imani Washington?" a man's voice asked, a voice tight with stress and urgency. The name, my old name, was a jolt, a key turning in a lock I had thought was rusted shut forever. "Who is this?" I asked, my own voice suddenly cautious. "Dr. Washington, this is Dr. Evans, Chief of Surgery at Grady Memorial Hospital. I know this is out of the blue. I got your number from the Johns Hopkins Alumni Directory. I was a few years ahead of you there. I remember your work. Everyone did. Grady Memorial, Johns Hopkins, names from a world I had tried to burn to the ground." "What do you want, Doctor?" "Evans?" "I need help," he said, and the raw, unvarnished desperation in his voice cut through the years of my exile. "We have a mass casualty event, a multi-car pileup on I-285, a tour bus full of school children. It's a war zone, Doctor. We are completely overwhelmed. They told me you were in Atlanta, and frankly, I don't care what you're doing now. I know what you can do. I know that you were one of the best trauma surgeons to ever come out of the Hopkins program." My mind, the surgeon's mind, which had been lying dormant, suddenly roared to life. The quiet, peaceful world of Gary, Indiana, of my simple nursing duties, of my love for Marcus, all of it dissolved. I was back in the world of blood and bone, of split-second decisions and life-saving calculations. The call of my true vocation, the one I had tried to silence, was a deafening siren in my soul. I had run from this life, from the pain and the pressure and the ghosts that haunted it. But I had not run from my oath. I turned my back to the dining room, my voice dropping into the crisp, commanding tone of a surgeon taking control. "How many victims?" I asked. The transformation instantaneous. "We have 30 inbound, at least 13 pediatric. 3 are critical. 1 is coding right now." The quiet, unassuming Imani, the simple nurse, the plain wife, was gone. In her place stood Dr. Washington. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, and hung up the phone. I walked back to the dining table. 3 pairs of eyes were staring at me, their expressions a mixture of shock and utter bewilderment. The woman who had left the table and the woman who had returned were 2 entirely different people. I looked at my husband, at Marcus, the man who had fallen in love with the quiet nurse, and I hoped he was ready to meet his wife. "I have to go," I said, my voice calm, steady, and radiating an authority they had never heard before. "There's been an accident." And then I walked out of the house, leaving my new family in a state of stunned silence, and drove into the heart of the storm. The drive from the quiet, tree-lined streets of the West End to the heart of downtown Atlanta was a journey through time, a regression from the peaceful present I had so carefully constructed back into the chaotic, siren-screaming past. With every mile, the carefully curated persona of Imani, the quiet wife, began to peel away. And the woman I had tried to bury, Dr. Washington, the trauma surgeon, clawed her way back to the surface. My hands on the steering wheel were steady, my focus absolute, but inside, a storm was raging. The muscle memory was there, the knowledge, the protocols, the deep, instinctual understanding of a broken human body. But the trauma was there too. The ghost of a man on an operating table, a life slipping through my fingers despite everything I did, a failure so profound it had sent me into a 3-year exile. Was I ready to face that ghost again? The question was irrelevant. A bus full of children, a city in crisis, a calling I could not ignore. I was not being asked if I was ready. I was being told I was necessary. Grady Memorial Hospital was an island of controlled chaos in a sea of red and blue flashing lights. The air was thick, with the metallic scent of blood and the cacophony of human suffering, the wails of the injured, the frantic shouts of paramedics, the steady, urgent commands of the hospital staff. Gurneys lined the hallways, each one holding a new and terrible story of shattered glass and twisted metal. For a moment, standing in the entryway, the sheer scale of the disaster threatened to overwhelm me. But then, the training took over. My mind, the surgeon's mind, automatically began to triage, to categorize, to impose order on the chaos. I saw not a tidal wave of pain, but a series of specific, solvable problems. Dr. Washington? A man in a blood-spattered white coat rushed towards me, his face a mask of exhaustion and profound relief. It was Dr. Evans, the chief of surgery. "Thank God you came," he said, his voice raw. "It's worse than we thought. We're out of surgeons, out of operating rooms. It's a complete catastrophe." "Where can I change?" I asked, my voice calm, my own panic locked away in a deep hidden vault. He led me to a small locker room. I shed the simple, unassuming dress of my new life, the dress Mildred had judged so harshly, and pulled on a set of anonymous blue surgical scrubs. The rough, sterile fabric felt more like home to me than any dress ever had. It was a uniform, a shield, the skin of the woman I truly was. As I tied my hair back, I looked at my reflection in the small, smudged mirror. The face was the same, plain, quiet Imani. But the eyes were different. They were the eyes of Dr. Washington, focused, intense, and ready for war. When I walked back out into the ER, I was no longer a wife or a daughter-in-law. I was a trauma surgeon, and I was in command. "Give me the worst of it," I said to Dr. Evans, and he did. Dr. Evans led me not to a prepped and waiting operating room, but into the heart of the storm itself. OR3 was a scene of controlled, desperate panic. A team of surgeons and nurses moved in a frantic dance around the operating table, their gowns splattered with blood, the floor slick with it. The air was thick with the metallic scent of it, and the steady, high-pitched alarm of a crashing heart monitor was a frantic scream that cut through the controlled chaos. "This is the one," Evans said, his voice grim. 10-year-old male crushed in the rollover, massive internal hemorrhaging, grade 4 liver laceration, and his pressure keeps bottoming out. We've been chasing the bleed for an hour. We're losing him, Imani. I moved towards the table, my eyes scanning the monitors, absorbing the data, the plummeting blood pressure, the racing heart rate, the low oxygen saturation. The patient, the small boy on the table, was a canvas of terrible injuries. As I stepped up, pulling on a pair of sterile gloves, the swinging doors of the OR flew open. A nurse was trying to restrain a frantic, weeping woman who was trying to push her way in. "That's my grandson," she shrieked, her voice a raw animal sound of pure maternal terror. "His name is Jamal." Please, God, you have to save my Jamal. It was Sister Beatrice, my new next door neighbor, the woman who had been whispering about my plain face just a few hours ago. Her eyes, red rimmed and wild with grief, met mine for a fraction of a second, but there was no recognition. She did not see the disappointing new wife of the neighborhood's golden boy. She saw only a faceless figure in blue scrubs, another person in a room where her grandchild was dying. The weight of the world, the fate of this woman's entire universe, settled onto my shoulders. I turned my back on her grief and focused on the task at hand. The world narrowed to the small broken body on the table in front of me. The other surgeons, weary and defeated, made space for me, their movements sluggish with exhaustion. I placed my hands on the boy's abdomen, my fingers probing gently, reading the story of his injuries through touch. The lead surgeon was barking orders, trying to clamp the bleeding from the shattered liver, but it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of sand. "It's not just the liver," I said, and my voice, calm and clear, cut through the noise of the room like a scalpel. Everyone stopped. "His abdomen is too rigid. The rebound tenderness is all wrong. You're chasing the wrong bleed." I looked at the lead surgeon, a man 20 years my senior, his face beaded with sweat. "Has anyone checked the spleen?" "We don't have time," he snapped, his ego bruised. "The liver is the immediate threat." "The liver is a distraction," I countered, my voice hardening with an authority I had not used in 3 years. "He's bleeding out from somewhere else. The pressure is dropping too fast." "Retract," I commanded a nearby nurse, pointing to a clamp. She hesitated, looking to the lead surgeon. I met his eyes. "Doctor," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, "you can either let me work or you can sign the death certificate." "Your choice." He stared at me for a heartbeat, his pride warring with the undeniable fact that his patient was dying. He gave a curt, angry nod. The moment he ceded command, I was in my element. The operating room became my orchestra, and I was the conductor. "Give me a wide view. I need to see the celiac trunk. Suction." My hands moved with a speed and a certainty that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. It was a language my body had never forgotten. As the surgical field was cleared, I saw it. It was exactly as I had suspected, a surgeon's worst nightmare. The splenic artery, the main vessel supplying blood to the spleen, had been almost completely sheared off at its root by a fractured rib. The team had been so focused on the large, obvious liver injury that they had missed the smaller, far more lethal one. They were pouring blood and fluids into a child whose main arterial line was wide open. "There," I said, pointing with a clamp. "That's our killer." A new, focused energy filled the room. The weary, defeated team was now a single, cohesive unit under my command. "We're going to ligate the artery," I announced, "and then we're going to have to do a full splenectomy. Let's move." For the next 4 hours, I worked. The world outside the operating room, my life in Atlanta, my broken past, all of it ceased to exist. There was only the delicate, beautiful, and brutal architecture of the human body and the intricate, bloody work of putting it back together. I moved with a grace and a precision that was a form of prayer. Every suture, every clamp, every cut a testament to the years of my devotion to this craft. There was a moment in the 3rd hour when we almost lost him. The steady beep of the heart monitor devolved into a single, terrifying, continuous tone. Flatline. "He's in V-fib," a nurse shouted. "Charging the paddles," another called out, but I was already there. "No time," I said, and in a move that was both brutally pragmatic and deeply intimate, I reached into the boy's chest cavity and began to manually massage his heart. My fingers wrapped around the still, silent muscle, trying to coax it back to life. It was the most primal act of medicine, a direct, desperate negotiation with death itself. And then a flicker. A single weak beat against my fingertips, and then another. The steady, rhythmic beep returned. The room breathed a collective sigh of relief. When it was finally over, when the last suture was tied and the final clamp was removed, a profound, exhausted silence settled over the room. The bleeding was stopped. The boy's vitals, while still fragile, were stable. He was alive. I stepped back from the table, my body aching, my mind a quiet, empty space. The other surgeons, the nurses, the entire team were just staring at me. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and a deep, profound respect. In their eyes, I saw the reflection of the woman I had once been, the woman I had tried to kill, Dr. Imani Washington, and she, it turned out, was not so easily buried. I stepped out of the operating room and into a world that had been fundamentally altered. The adrenaline that had sustained me for the last several hours vanished in an instant, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that was both physical and spiritual. The controlled chaos of the hospital had subsided, the tide of trauma having receded, leaving behind the quiet, exhausted work of recovery. As I walked down the long, sterile corridor toward the locker room, the atmosphere around me was different. The nurses and doctors I passed, who before had been strangers, now looked at me with a new expression. It was a look of awe, of reverence, of a deep and sudden respect. Whispers followed me like a ripple in the water. "That's her. That's Dr. Washington, the one who saved the Braxton boy." Dr. Evans met me by the surgical lounge, his face haggard with fatigue, but his eyes shining with a gratitude so intense it was humbling. "Imani," he said, using my first name for the first time. "I don't have the words. What you did in there. It was a masterclass. You saved that boy's life. You saved 3 lives today that we would have otherwise lost." He shook his head in disbelief. "I don't know what your situation is, what brought you to Atlanta, or why you were working as a nurse in Gary, Indiana, and frankly, I don't care. But I would be the biggest fool in this city if I didn't offer you a permanent position on my surgical team, right here, right now. Chief of Trauma Surgery. You can name your price. Just say yes." The offer, which a few years ago would have been the culmination of all my ambitions, now felt like a complication I wasn't ready to face. I had come to this city to escape, to be anonymous. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. I gave him a non-committal answer, my mind too weary to process the implications of his offer, and continued on my way. My only thought, a desperate, aching need to see my husband. I found Marcus in the hospital's main lobby, his face a mask of anxiety. He had been waiting for hours, hearing the fragmented stories, the whispers of the miracle worker who had appeared out of nowhere. When he saw me, in my blood-spattered scrubs, my face pale with exhaustion, he rushed to me. He didn't speak. He just wrapped his arms around me, holding me tight, a silent, powerful gesture of awe and a new, deeper understanding. He had married a quiet, unassuming nurse. He was now beginning to understand that he had married a phoenix, a woman who had just risen from the ashes of a past he knew nothing about. The news of the hero doctor of Grady Memorial had traveled faster than we had. When we pulled up to his mother's house in the West End, the atmosphere on the street was completely transformed. The curtains that had been drawn for judgmental whispering were now wide open. Neighbors were out on their porches, and their looks were no longer of suspicion, but of gratitude and wonder. Standing on the front porch, her hands twisting a handkerchief, was Sister Beatrice. The moment I stepped out of the car, she rushed towards me, her face stained with tears, but her eyes shining with a light of pure, unadulterated joy. "Dr. Washington!" she cried, and she threw her arms around me, this proud, formidable woman, and hugged me with the strength of a grateful grandmother. "They told me what you did. You saved my Jamal. You saved my baby. How can I ever thank you?" I stood there, stunned, as other neighbors began to approach, bringing offerings of food, a Tupperware of macaroni and cheese, a freshly baked sweet potato pie, humble, heartfelt apologies for their earlier judgment. Inside the house, even Mildred looked at me with a new, grudging respect. For a fleeting, beautiful moment, I felt a sense of profound peace. I was exhausted, but I was home. I had a husband who loved me, and a community that, in a single fiery trial, had finally, fully accepted me. Not for my face or my clothes, but for the skill in my hands and the strength in my heart. I had found my sanctuary. It was this perfect, fragile moment of peace that was shattered by the arrival of the sleek black town car. It purred to a stop in front of the house, a silent, menacing intrusion from another world, a world of power and politics that had no place on this quiet residential street. The back door opened, and a woman emerged. She was tall, elegant, dressed in a sharply tailored suit, her face a mask of cold, controlled fury. She radiated an aura of power and a deep, inconsolable grief. She walked directly up the path to the porch, her eyes fixed on me, ignoring everyone else as if they were simply part of the scenery. "Dr. Imani Washington," she said, her voice like ice, each word a perfectly enunciated shard of glass. "I thought I recognized the name when I heard it on the news this evening. I couldn't believe you would have the audacity to show your face in this city." A cold dread, a ghost from my past, rose up to grip my heart. I knew who she was before she even said her name. I am City Councilwoman Rochelle DeVry, she announced, her voice rising, ensuring everyone on the porch could hear. 3 years ago in Baltimore, you operated on my husband, Alex DeVry. He died on your table. She took another step closer, her eyes burning into mine with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. You may have fooled these people into thinking you're a hero, she said, her voice shaking with a grief that had curdled into pure venom. But I know what you are. You're a killer, and I will not rest until every single person in this city knows it, too. Rochelle DeVry's words hung in the warm evening air, a toxic, radioactive cloud that instantly poisoned the atmosphere of goodwill and celebration. The half-eaten plates of food, the congratulatory handshakes, the tears of gratitude, all of it curdled in the face of her accusation. My new neighbors, who had just moments before been hailing me as a hero, now stared at me with a new, unsettling expression, a mixture of confusion, suspicion, and a morbid, hungry curiosity. Sister Beatrice, whose grandson's life I had just saved, looked utterly bewildered, her loyalty to me now at war with the undeniable authority of a powerful city councilwoman. I saw the narrative of my new life being rewritten before my very eyes, the title of hero being violently crossed out and replaced with a question mark. The siege began the very next morning. Rochelle DeVry was a master of her craft, and her craft was the manipulation of public opinion. She didn't launch a direct frontal assault at first. She was more subtle, more insidious. She gave a statement to a popular Atlanta news blog, a carefully worded expression of concern about the hiring standards at the city's hospitals. In the wake of recent events, she was quoted as saying, "It is imperative that we ensure our medical professionals, especially those in critical care, have impeccable and unquestionable histories. Our citizens deserve to know they are in the safest possible hands." She never mentioned my name. She didn't have to. The story of the miracle doctor from Gary, Indiana was already news. She had simply attached a dark, ominous asterisk to it. The poison seeped into the West End with an insidious speed. The community, which had been so quick to embrace me in my triumph, was now fractured with doubt. The warm greetings I received on my morning walk were replaced by hesitant nods and furtive, sideways glances. The Tupperware containers that had appeared on our porch, filled with food, no longer came. I overheard Miss Pearl talking to a neighbor over the fence, her voice a low, concerned whisper. "Well, you know what they say. Where there's smoke, there's fire." Sister Beatrice remained my staunchest defender, her loyalty fierce and absolute. "I don't care what that woman says," she declared to anyone who would listen. "I care about what I saw. And I saw Dr. Washington's hands, guided by the grace of God, saved my grandbaby's life." But her voice was becoming a lonely one in a rising chorus of whispers. The heaviest fire, however, came from inside the house. My mother-in-law, Mildred, was horrified. The brief grudging respect she had shown me had vanished, replaced by a renewed and now validated sense of dread. To her, I was not just an unsuitable wife for her son, I was a public scandal, a stain on the pristine reputation of the Johnson family name. "I knew it," she said to Marcus that evening, her voice a low, trembling hiss of accusation, assuming I was out of earshot. I knew there was something wrong with her from the moment I laid eyes on her. "You brought this trouble into my house, Marcus. A killer living under my roof." Her words, meant to wound me, did not hit their intended target. My skin, toughened by years of professional and personal battles, had grown thick. The true casualty of her fear-mongering was her own son. I saw the toll it was taking on Marcus, the way he was being torn between his fierce, protective love for me and his lifelong, ingrained duty to his mother. He was living on a new, domestic battlefield, and the stress was beginning to wear him down. The sanctuary he had offered me, the home he had brought me to, had become a war zone, and I, once again, was the cause. The pressure inside our small home became a living thing, a constant suffocating presence. Mildred's fear and disapproval radiated through the walls, poisoning the quiet moments, turning our sanctuary into a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial. The strain was beginning to fray my husband. I saw it in the new, tired lines around his eyes, in the way he would clench his jaw when his mother would make a passive-aggressive comment at the dinner table. He was a man caught between two powerful loyalties, and the effort of serving as a bridge between his mother's history and his wife's present was wearing him down. I knew this could not continue. It wasn't fair to him. He was fighting a war on my behalf, But he was doing it blindfolded, armed only with his faith in me. He deserved to know what ghosts we were fighting. The breaking point came late one night, after a particularly difficult day. Mildred had forwarded Marcus an email from a church friend containing a link to the news blog article Rochelle had planted, with a simple, cutting message. "I'm just so worried about our family's reputation." The ensuing argument had been quiet, but brutal, ending with Marcus telling his mother for the first time in his life that his wife's honor was not a subject for debate. The victory was a hollow one, leaving him exhausted and me consumed with guilt. Later, in the quiet of our bedroom, he came and sat on the edge of the bed where I was staring out at the dark, silent street. "Imani," he said, his voice low and weary but full of a profound and gentle love, "I believe you. I will never for 1 second not believe you. I will stand with you against my mother, against that councilwoman, against the whole world if I have to." He took my hand, his own warm and steady around mine. "But I'm fighting a ghost, baby. And I don't know its name. You have to let me in. You have to tell me everything. What really happened that night in Baltimore?" His plea was not an accusation. It was an invitation. It was an offer to share a burden he knew I had been carrying alone for too long. And looking at his dear, tired face, I knew he was right. I could no longer protect him from my past. If we were to survive this, we had to survive it together. And so, for the first time, I spoke the story aloud. I took a deep breath, and I told him everything. I told him about Alex DeVry. He had been in a catastrophic high-speed collision on the interstate, his car crushed between two semi-trucks. He had arrived at my hospital in Baltimore with injuries that the paramedics had bluntly, grimly described as incompatible with life. His heart had already stopped twice in the ambulance. The attending physician in the ER had taken one look at his chart and had begun the grim procedural work of calling the time of death. But I had been the trauma fellow on call that night, young, ambitious, and, as my mentor doctor, Abernathy used to say, too brilliant and stubborn to know when to quit. I saw a flicker of neurological response, a 1 in a million chance, a path to a miracle that no one else could see. The case was a lost cause, which was the only reason a senior surgeon like Dr. Abernathy, who was overseeing my fellowship, had allowed me, a resident, to take the lead. "He's all yours, Washington," I remember him saying, his voice sounding distant and strange that night. "Show me what you can do." I told Marcus about the surgery, the 8 straight hours under the harsh white lights of the operating room, a marathon of desperate, high-wire acts of medical artistry. I described the intricate dance of clamping arteries, of repairing a shattered aorta, of fighting a battle against time and a body that was determined to die. There were moments, I confessed, when I thought I had him, when his vitals would stabilize for a few precious minutes and a surge of triumphant hope would flood the room. And then I told him about the final, inevitable moment when, despite everything, every trick and technique I knew, his body simply gave out. He had died on my table. As I spoke, the clinical, detached language of the surgeon fell away, and the raw, unhealed trauma of the woman was laid bare. I told him about the aftermath. Rochelle DeVry, a powerful and well-connected political figure consumed by a grief so absolute it demanded a villain, had targeted me. She had launched a vicious public campaign and a lawsuit for malpractice. The hospital, needing a scapegoat, had quietly settled, and my career, the one I had dedicated my entire life to, was destroyed. To avoid being blacklisted from every hospital in the country, I had voluntarily placed my medical license on inactive status and had simply disappeared. I had fled to Gary, Indiana, a place where no one would know my name, a place where I could be a simple nurse, where I could heal, and where I could hide. The only thing I did not tell him, the one crucial and most damning secret, was the reason my mentor, the great doctor. Charles Abernathy had not taken the lead on the case himself that night. I did not tell him that his voice had been distant and strange because he was drunk. I did not tell him that I, his protégé, had covered for him, had fought that impossible battle alone, and had then allowed my career to be sacrificed to protect his. That was a promise I had made, a burden of loyalty I still carried. When my story was finished, the room was silent, the only sound my own ragged, quiet sobs. Marcus didn't speak for a long time. He simply pulled me into his arms and held me, letting me cry out the years of pain and solitude. When I finally quieted, he tilted my face up to his. His eyes were not full of doubt or suspicion. They were shining with a fierce, protective pride and a love that was a balm to my soul. "You're not a killer, Imani," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a warrior. You fought for that man when no one else would. You did everything you could." He held me tighter. "And I'm not going to let them take anything else from you. We're going to fight this. Together." In the safety of his arms, with his unwavering faith as my shield, I felt a flicker of a strength I thought had died on that operating table 3 years ago. For a few precious days, the fortress of our marriage felt impregnable. Armed with the truth of my past and fortified by my husband's unwavering love, I felt a resurgence of a strength I thought I had lost forever. The whispers in the neighborhood, the cold stares, my mother-in-law's simmering disapproval, it all seemed like a distant, manageable storm, as long as Marcus and I were standing together in the quiet eye of our own truth. We were a unit, a two-person army, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that our love was a strong enough shield to withstand any attack. But I had underestimated the power, the resources, and the sheer grief-fueled tenacity of my enemy. Rochelle DeVry was not accustomed to being ignored. My refusal to flee, my quiet dignity in the face of her attacks, and the stubborn vocal support I retained from a small but significant part of the community, led by the eternally grateful Sister Beatrice, had clearly infuriated her. She had expected me to be a weak, easy target, a disgraced doctor who would crumble at the first sign of public pressure. When I did not, she escalated her campaign from a war of whispers to a full-scale political assault. She was a city councilwoman, a woman who understood the intricate levers of power, and she now began to pull them with a ruthless precision. The first blow landed on a Tuesday morning. The caller ID was from Grady Memorial Hospital. It was Dr. Evans. His voice, which had been so full of awe and excitement when he had offered me the job, was now heavy with a weary, apologetic resignation. "Imani," he began, and I knew from his tone that the news was bad. "I don't know how to say this. Rochelle DeVry is on the hospital's oversight committee. She's leveraging her position. She's threatening to launch a public televised hearing into what she's calling the hiring of medically and ethically compromised individuals in our city's hospitals." He let out a heavy sigh. "It's a political witch hunt, and you are the target. The board is panicking. They're terrified of the PR nightmare." "What are you saying, Charles?" I asked, my voice quiet, already knowing the answer. "They're forcing my hand," he said, and I could hear the genuine self-loathing in his voice. I have to officially rescind the job offer for Chief of Trauma. They're putting it on hold, pending a full investigation." "Imani, I am so sorry. You are the best surgeon I have ever seen, and they are letting politics poison this hospital." I hung up the phone, a cold, familiar numbness spreading through me. The one door back to my old life, the one path to reclaiming my true identity, had just been slammed shut and bolted. The message was clear. My past, or at least Rochelle DeVry's version of it, would not be so easily escaped. The public attack, now that the hospital had capitulated, became more direct. A local tabloid-style news website ran a story with a sensational clickbait headline, "Hero or Butcher? Questions swirl around Atlanta's new miracle doctor." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, quoting anonymous sources from Baltimore and highlighting the malpractice lawsuit, while conveniently omitting the fact that it had been settled by the hospital with no finding of fault on my part. The whispers in the West End were now a roar. The looks of suspicion were now looks of open hostility. The final violating blow came in the dead of night. We were woken by the sound of a car speeding away, its tires squealing in the darkness. When Marcus went to the window, he let out a low, guttural curse. I rushed to his side and looked out, and there on the clean white wood of our front fence, spray-painted in huge, dripping, blood-red letters, was a single ugly word, "murderer." That was my breaking point. To see that word, that lie, branded onto our home, our sanctuary, was a violation so profound it shattered the last of my resolve. This was no longer just about me. My ghost, my past, had come to haunt not just me, but the man I loved. It was endangering him. It was destroying his peace. It was poisoning his relationship with his own mother and his community. I had fled Baltimore to contain the fallout from that one tragic night, but the radiation was leaking out. and it was contaminating everything and everyone I held dear. I had not escaped my past. I had simply, selfishly brought it here to ruin a new set of lives. I looked at Marcus, at his face, which was a mask of furious, protective rage, and I saw in that moment the only path left to me, the only way to save him. The next evening, after another day of tense, drawn silence, I turned to him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. "I have to leave, Marcus," I said, my voice a dead, lifeless thing. "I brought this darkness into your life. I brought this poison into your home. The only way to save you from it, the only way for you to ever have your peaceful life back, is for me to disappear again. For good this time." My words, my declaration of surrender, hung in the air between us, a white flag raised over a battlefield I no longer had the strength to defend. I saw the relief in Marcus's eyes that I had finally spoken the thought, mixed with a profound, aching sorrow. He had brought me here to be his wife, to build a life, and instead, I had brought a war to his doorstep. To leave felt like the only act of love I had left to give, a final, painful surgery to excise the cancerous past from his peaceful future. But my husband, the man whose gentle soul had been my only sanctuary, was not going to let me perform this final self-destructive act. "No," he said. The word was not loud, but it was absolute, a foundation of unshakable conviction. He came to me and took my hands, his grip firm and grounding. "No, Imani. We are not running. I am not letting you disappear again." He looked into my eyes, and his were filled not with the exhaustion I had expected, but with a fierce, unwavering fire. "Your past is not a ghost, Imani," he said, his voice low and intense. "It's a lie that has been told about you, a lie that has followed you for 3 years. We don't run from lies, we fight them, we burn them to the ground with the truth." "What truth, Marcus?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "The truth is that a man died. The truth is that I was his doctor. The truth is that his wife wants to destroy me, and she has the power to do it." "That's not the whole truth," he insisted. "The truth is that you are a good person and a brilliant doctor. The truth is that you have a right to a life, to a home, to peace. If we run now, we let Rochelle DeVry win. We let her lie become your story. Forever. I will not let that happen." His strength, his absolute faith in me was a transfusion, pouring life back into my weary, defeated spirit. It was in that moment that we heard a frantic, furious pounding on our front door. We looked at each other, a new dread dawning. It was Sister Beatrice, her face a mask of righteous fury, a rolled-up newspaper clutched in her hand like a weapon. "I just saw this," she declared, marching into our living room without waiting for an invitation. She unrolled the paper. It was a local community newsletter. On the front page was a notice: "Community meeting tonight, 7 p.m. First Baptist Church Hall, hosted by Councilwoman Rochelle DeVry to address community safety and the concerning background of a new resident." "She is not going to get away with this," Sister Beatrice seethed, her loyalty a blazing fire. "This is not a community meeting. It's a public execution, and you are the one she means to hang. But she has forgotten one thing. This is my church, and this is my neighborhood. And you," she said, turning to me, her eyes fierce, "are the woman who saved my grandbaby's life. You will not face that viper alone." A new plan, a terrifying and audacious one, began to form. To run was to admit guilt. To hide was to surrender. There was only one path left. We had to walk into the heart of the storm. We had to go to that meeting. We had to face my accuser, my past, and our community head on. I did not know what I would say. I did not know how we could possibly win against a lie so powerful. But as I stood there, flanked by my loving husband and this fierce, loyal neighbor, I knew one thing for certain. I was done running. The church hall was the same room where, just a few weeks prior, a community had gathered to celebrate one of its own. Tonight, that same space, with its faint scent of lemon polish and old hymnals, had been transformed into a coliseum, and the crowd had gathered for a blood sport. The air was thick with tension, a palpable buzzing energy of a community at war with itself. The room was literally divided. On the left side sat Rochelle DeVry's supporters, a collection of the city's well-heeled and influential, their faces stern and judgmental. On the right sat my small ragtag army, Sister Beatrice, her son, her daughter-in-law, and the grateful, determined parents of the other children whose lives I had saved. Between them sat the rest of the West End community, a sea of curious, anxious, and undecided faces, their loyalties up for grabs. We took our seats in the front row on the right, a silent, unified front. Marcus's hand rested on my knee, a warm, steady anchor in the churning sea of my anxiety. Rochelle de Vries was already on the stage, standing at a podium, a portrait of elegant, righteous grief. She was a politician in her natural habitat, and this was not a community meeting. It was a rally, and she was its star. Her speech was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. She began by speaking of her love for the city of Atlanta, for this community. Then, her voice cracking with a perfectly timed tremor, she spoke of her late husband, Alex. She painted a picture of a brilliant, loving man, a pillar of his community, a devoted father, cut down in his prime. She spoke of the night he had died, her voice dropping to a raw, grief-stricken whisper. And then she turned her attention to me. That night, she said, her voice rising with a new, sharp edge of fury, her eyes finding mine in the crowd, my husband's life was in the hands of a young, arrogant, and reckless surgeon. A doctor who, instead of following protocol, engaged in a risky experimental surgery on a man who needed stable, proven care. A doctor whose actions were so questionable that she was forced to flee the city of Baltimore in disgrace. She let the words hang in the air, a poisonous accusation. And now, she continued, her voice ringing with a protective maternal fire, this same doctor, Imani Washington has come here, to our city, to our community. She has charmed you with one single lucky night at Grady Memorial. But I am here to ask you, can we afford to put our children, our husbands, our wives in the hands of a doctor with a past she refuses to explain? I am here tonight as your councilwoman, as a grieving widow, and as a concerned citizen to demand that we protect ourselves. We must send a clear message that our community is not a hiding place for doctors with questionable histories and fatal mistakes on their records. She finished to a wave of thunderous applause from her side of the room. The narrative was powerful, compelling. She was the grieving widow, the public servant protecting her people. I was the dangerous outsider, the butcher with a scalpel. I felt the mood of the room shift, the undecided faces now looking at me with a new, harder suspicion. Then the moderator called my name. It was my turn. Marcus squeezed my knee. "Just tell the truth," he whispered. "Your truth." I walked the long, lonely aisle to the stage, every footstep echoing in the suddenly silent hall. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, dissecting me, judging me. I stood at the podium, my hands gripping its sides, and looked out at the crowd. My voice when I began was not loud, but it was clear and steady. "My name is Dr. Imani Washington," I said, "and I am not a killer." I did not look at Rochelle de Vries. I spoke to the community. What Councilwoman de Vries told you is her version of the truth, and she is entitled to it. Her grief is real, and it is profound. The truth I can offer is my own. I told them not of medical procedures, but of the sacred oath I took as a doctor. I spoke of the solemn, awesome responsibility of holding a human life in your hands. "The night Mr. de Vries died," I said, my voice quiet but unwavering, "he had injuries that every other medical professional had deemed unsurvivable. To do nothing would have been to let him die. I chose to fight. I fought for 8 hours. I used every ounce of my skill, every bit of my training, every prayer in my heart to try and save him. And in the end, I failed. And that is a failure I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I cannot give Mrs. de Vries her husband back. All I can do is promise you, the people of this community, that if your child or your husband or your wife ever ends up on my operating table, I will fight just as hard for them." A new, confused silence settled over the room. My quiet sincerity was a stark contrast to Rochelle's fiery rhetoric, and it had thrown them off balance. It was in that moment of peak, uncertain tension that the heavy oak doors at the back of the church hall swung open with a loud, dramatic creak. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway. He was older, in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair and the weary, stooped shoulders of a man carrying a great and terrible weight. He began to walk slowly, deliberately, down the center aisle. A murmur went through the crowd. I stared, my heart suddenly pounding a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. I knew him. The face was older, lined with a grief and a shame I did not recognize. But I knew him. It was Doctor Charles Abernathy, my mentor, the man whose secret I had protected for 3 long years. And he was walking towards the stage. Doctor. Abernathy walked down the center aisle of the church hall, and with every slow, deliberate step he took, the entire emotional landscape of the room seemed to shift. The murmuring of the crowd died down, replaced by a deep, waiting silence. He was a man on a mission, a ghost from a past I thought I had buried, and he had come here to this place for a reason. He did not look at me. He walked directly to the stage, his gaze fixed on some distant point of personal reckoning. He ascended the small set of stairs, his movements heavy with a weariness that was more than just physical. He walked to the podium, standing beside me, and for the first time he turned and looked at me. In his eyes I saw a universe of shame, of regret, and a quiet, desperate plea for a forgiveness I did not know how to give. He then turned to face the stunned, silent crowd. "My name is Dr. Charles Abernathy," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that commanded the attention of the entire room. It was the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime in positions of authority, a voice that was accustomed to being heard. I was for 20 years the chief of trauma surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and I was Dr. Imani Washington's mentor. I am the man who trained her. He paused, letting his credentials settle over the room. He then turned his gaze directly to Rochelle DeVry, who was watching him with a look of wary confusion. "Mrs. DeVry," he said, his voice softening with a genuine, profound sadness. "I never had the courage to speak to you personally, and that is a failure I will regret for the rest of my life. I am here tonight to tell you the truth about the night your husband died, a truth that only 2 people in this world have known until this moment." A new, more intense silence fell over the room. "The story Dr. Washington told you is true," he continued. "Your husband's injuries were catastrophic. His chances of survival were less than 1%. She did fight for 8 hours, with a skill and a courage I have never, in my 40-year career, seen equaled. But what she did not tell you, what she has protected, at the cost of her own career and her own good name, is the reason why she had to fight that battle alone." He took a deep, shuddering breath, a man standing on the gallows of his own making, ready to finally face the rope. "The reason I, the chief of surgery, the senior surgeon on call, did not lead that operation," he said, his voice dropping, but clear and steady in the silent hall, "is that I was drunk. I was in my office with a bottle of scotch, in the middle of a long and ugly battle with an alcoholism that had consumed my life. I was unfit to hold a scalpel. I was a coward, and I was a disgrace to my profession." The confession was a quiet, devastating explosion. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Rochelle DeVry's face went white, her hands flying to her mouth. I just stood there, frozen, as the secret I had carried for 3 years, the secret that had defined and destroyed my life, was finally brought out into the light. "When they brought your husband in, Dr. Abernathy continued, his eyes still fixed on Rochelle, "I was the one who should have been at that table. But I couldn't do it. In my shame, in my drunken haze, I was ready to let him die. It was Imani, my resident, this brilliant, honorable, and fiercely dedicated young doctor who refused. She was the one who insisted they fight, and I, in my cowardice, let her. I let her take on an impossible, hopeless case, a case that was doomed from the start." He finally turned and looked at me, his eyes full of tears. "And when it was over," he said, his voice breaking, "when the inevitable happened and your husband died and the lawsuit came, I was terrified. I was a man on the edge of losing everything, my license, my reputation, my family. And so I did the most shameful thing I've ever done. I begged this young woman, this doctor with a future more brilliant than any I had ever seen, to protect me. I asked her to keep my secret. And she, out of a sense of loyalty and a grace that I've never understood, agreed. Dr. Washington did not lose her career because she was incompetent or reckless. She sacrificed it. She sacrificed her entire future to save mine." He stepped back from the podium, his confession complete, his soul laid bare for the entire world to see. The silence that followed was not just the absence of sound, it was a profound, holy thing. It was the sound of a world being reordered, of a narrative being completely and utterly shattered. The story was no longer a simple tale of a grieving widow and a killer doctor. It was now a complex, heartbreaking tragedy of human frailty, of sacrifice, and of a quiet, incredible heroism that had gone unseen for 3 long years. I looked out at the faces in the crowd. Rochelle DeVry was a broken figure, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with the sobs of a woman who had just realized she'd been aiming her grief at the wrong target, that there had in fact never been a target at all. I saw Mildred, my mother-in-law, looking at me as if for the very first time, her face a mask of awe and a dawning profound shame for her own petty judgments. And I saw the rest of the community, my community, looking at me with a new, deep, and unwavering respect. The public trial was over, and I had been vindicated, not by my own words, but by the truth, a truth that had finally, at long last, set me free. The church hall, which had been a crucible of judgment just an hour earlier, was now a space of quiet, reverent awe. The angry mob had dissolved, its fury extinguished by the cleansing fire of the truth. In its place was a community humbled, shamed, and ultimately united in its profound respect for the woman they had so badly misjudged. People came up to me one by one, their faces full of a remorse that was deep and sincere. They didn't offer empty platitudes. They offered quiet, heartfelt apologies, which I accepted with a simple, graceful nod. My war for acceptance was over. The 2 most important conversations, however, happened after the crowd had dispersed in the quiet, empty hall that still seemed to echo with the weight of the night's confessions. The first was with Dr. Abernathy. He stood before me, a man stripped of all his former authority, his face a ruin of shame. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He simply said, "I am so sorry, Imani, for everything." I looked at the man who had been my mentor, my hero, and then the source of my greatest pain. The anger I had once felt was gone, replaced by a deep, weary sadness for the years we had both lost to his secret. "You were a coward, Charles," I said, my voice quiet, not with accusation, but with a simple statement of fact. "But you were a good man who made a terrible mistake, and tonight you found your courage again. That is enough." It was not a full absolution, but it was a bridge. It was closure. The second conversation was with Rochelle DeVry. She approached me as doctor. Abernathy was leaving, her own face a mask of a grief that was new and raw, a grief for a truth she had never known. "Dr. Washington," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper, "there are no words. I have spent 3 years consumed by a hatred for you. You were the villain in my story. I see now that I was wrong. I was so wrong." She looked at me, her eyes full of a pain that I understood all too well. "Can you ever forgive me?" "There is nothing to forgive," I said, and I meant it. "You were a wife, grieving for your husband. You needed a place to put your anger. I was the easiest target." I paused, and then I offered her the only other truth I had. "And for what it's worth, Mrs. DeVry," I said softly, "you must forgive me for not being able to save him." We stood there for a moment, 2 women on opposite sides of the same tragedy, and in that shared, quiet space, we found a moment of profound human grace. Finally, there was my family. Marcus was a pillar of quiet, proud support by my side, but it was Mildred, my mother-in-law, who walked towards me, her own face stained with tears. She stopped in front of me and took both of my hands in hers. "Imani," she began, her voice thick with a shame that was deep and genuine, "I have been a fool. A proud, blind, and judgmental fool." She looked me in the eye, her old haughtiness completely gone, replaced by a raw maternal humility. "I was so busy looking at the simple dress you were wearing, I failed to see the incredible woman who was in it. I'm so sorry, daughter." She called me daughter, and in that one simple word, the final wall between us crumbled. I had not just been vindicated, I had, at long last, been welcomed home. The days following the community meeting were like waking up from a long and terrible fever. The world, which had been a hostile, threatening place, was suddenly full of a soft, welcoming light. The whispers on our street were replaced by warm, genuine smiles. The looks of suspicion were replaced by waves of greeting from neighbors working in their gardens. I was no longer an outsider to be judged, but a cherished member of the community, a hero who belonged to them. The transformation was most profound in my own home. Mildred, my mother-in-law, had completely shed her old judgmental skin. She now looked at me with a fierce maternal pride, fussing over me, making sure I was eating enough, her love for her son finally expanding to include the woman he had chosen. Our house was no longer a place of tension, but a true sanctuary, a home filled with a peace that was deep and real. A week after the meeting, the official call came from Grady Memorial Hospital. It was Dr. Evans, but his voice was different, imbued with a new formality. He was calling, he said, on behalf of the entire hospital board. They had held an emergency meeting. The offer to make me the new chief of trauma surgery was not only back on the table, but it was now accompanied by a public statement of their unequivocal support, a formal apology for their political hesitation, and a compensation package that was frankly breathtaking. The offer was real, it was official, and it was waiting for my answer. And so, I was faced with the final, most important choice of all. For 3 years, all I had wanted was to escape the life of a surgeon. I had yearned for a quiet, simple, and anonymous existence, a life free from the crushing pressure, the life and death stakes, and the ghosts that haunted the long, sterile corridors of a hospital. I had found that life for a brief, beautiful moment with Marcus and Gary, Indiana. I could have it again. I could politely decline Dr. Evans' offer. I could work part-time in a local clinic or simply not work at all. I could be a wife, a daughter-in-law, a neighbor. I could have a life of peace. Or I could choose the other path. I could step back into the fire. I could accept the position and embrace the identity of Dr. Washington once more. I could take on the immense responsibility, the long hours, the constant dance with death. I could welcome the ghosts of the past back into my life, not as specters to be feared, but as constant reminders of the stakes of the work I was called to do. It was a choice between the life my traumatized self craved and the life my true self was born to live. That night, I sat on the porch with Marcus, the warm Georgia air a soft blanket around us. I laid out the two paths before me, the two women I could choose to be. He listened, as he always did, with a quiet, patient love. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time, watching the fireflies begin their nightly, blinking dance in the twilight. "When I met you in that hospital in Gary," he said finally, his voice soft, "I fell in love with Imani. I fell in love with her quiet strength, her kindness, her beautiful, brilliant mind that was so much bigger than the small life she was trying to live. And when I saw you in that operating room at Grady, when I heard the stories of what you did, I was in absolute awe of Dr. Washington, this incredible, heroic force of nature." He turned to me, and his eyes were full of a love so pure and unconditional it took my breath away. "I will love you and be proud of you, no matter which of those women you choose to be. I fell in love with the person, Imani, not the job title. All I want, the only thing I have ever wanted, is for you to be happy." His words were the final key, unlocking the last door of my prison. My fear had been that embracing my old life would mean sacrificing my new one. That Dr. Washington would somehow consume the quiet, simple Imani that Marcus had fallen in love with. But he saw them not as two different people, but as two parts of one whole. His love was not conditional on my being small or quiet. His love was a platform, not a cage. He was not giving me the answer. He was giving me the freedom to choose my own. I thought about the little boy, Jamal, his life now whole and full of promise. I thought about the other lives I had saved, the families I had kept whole. My talent, my skill with a scalpel, was not a curse. It was not the source of my trauma. It was a gift, a sacred life-saving gift, and to bury it, to hide it away in the name of a quiet life, would be the greatest tragedy of all. It would be a betrayal, not of a mentor or a hospital, but of myself. The next morning I called Dr. Evans. "Charles," I said, my voice full of a new calm certainty, "I would be honored to accept the position as chief of trauma surgery." I could hear the profound relief and joy in his voice. But this time I was not just accepting a job. I was accepting myself. I was choosing to be whole, to be both the quiet woman who loved her husband and her garden and the brilliant, formidable surgeon who could command an operating room and bring the dead back to life. I had finally found my sanctuary, not by running away, but by standing my ground and daring to be my whole true self. A year later, the world was a different place. Or perhaps it was simply that I was a different woman living in it. I had stepped into my role as chief of trauma surgery at Grady Memorial, not with the frantic workaholic desperation of my youth, but with the calm, balanced authority of a woman who understood the value of her own peace. My days were a demanding but deeply fulfilling rhythm of healing, of teaching, of leading. I fought my battles in the operating room, and then I came home. I came home to my husband, to my garden, to the quiet, tree-lined streets of a neighborhood that had become my sanctuary. The final, beautiful, and healing scene of my long journey took place on a warm Saturday in late summer. It was the annual West End Community Picnic, a vibrant, joyful affair held in the local park. The air was thick with the scent of barbecue and the sound of gospel music from a small live band. A year ago, I would have dreaded such an event. The thought of all those eyes on me, of all the whispers, would have been a form of torture. Today, I move through the crowd with an easy, quiet confidence, my hand in my husband's, a beloved and respected member of my community. I saw Jamal, Sister Beatrice's grandson, chase a football across the grass. His laughter loud and carefree, his body strong and whole, with no sign of the terrible injuries that had almost claimed his life. He saw me and broke away from his game, running to me at full speed and wrapping his arms around my legs in a fierce hug. "Dr. Imani," he shouted, his face a beam of pure, childish adoration. Sister Beatrice, watching from a nearby picnic blanket, simply smiled, a look of profound, unending gratitude in her eyes. I spent the afternoon moving through the beautiful, chaotic tapestry of my new life. I laughed with Marcus. I debated the merits of different tomato fertilizers with my neighbors, and I sat with the church elders, who now treated me not just as a member, but as a pillar of their flock. My life was no longer a secret to be hidden or a past to be run from. It was a single, whole, and beautiful thing. Later in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in soft golden hues, I saw them. Mildred, Sister Beatrice, and Ms. Pearl were sitting together on a bench under a large oak tree, a trio of neighborhood matriarchs. They were watching me as I played with Jamal, and their conversation carried on the warm breeze was no longer one of judgment, but of something else entirely. "I was such a fool," Mildred said, her voice quiet, full of a soft, reflective shame. "I spent so much time worrying about what people would think, about finding a wife for my son who would look good in the family Christmas card." She shook her head, her eyes fixed on me, a deep and genuine love in her gaze. "I was looking for a daughter with a pretty face. But my son, my wise, wonderful son, he brought home a woman with healing hands and a heart of gold." "Amen to that," Sister Beatrice said, her hand patting Mildred's knee. "That woman," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that was still raw, "is the reason I can still hear my grandbabies laugh. Her hands are blessed, Mildred. Blessed by God, Miss." Pearl, the most notorious gossip in the neighborhood, just nodded, her eyes wide with a respect that had long since replaced her initial suspicion. "They were right," she said softly. "The papers. The news. She really is a hero." Mildred smiled. A real, genuine smile of pure maternal pride. "She's more than that," she said. "She's family. And she is, without a doubt, the most beautiful woman I've ever known." I, of course, did not hear their words, but I felt them. I felt the warmth of their acceptance, the solid ground of my belonging. Marcus came and stood behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder as we watched. Jamal tried to teach an old dog a new trick. "Happy?" he whispered in my ear. I leaned back into him, my heart full to bursting with a quiet, profound, and steady joy. "Happy," I confirmed. I was no longer a ghost running from a past I couldn't escape. I was no longer a phoenix, defined by the fire I had risen from. I was simply Imani, a wife, a doctor, a neighbor, a friend. I was a woman who had finally realized that her sanctuary was not a place to hide from the world, but the quiet, strong space within herself, a space she could now, finally, call home.